Gondor is a good side faction that seems to be very popular in Rise to War gameplay thanks to its popularity in the literature and the films. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down the pros and the cons of Gondor so that you can understand whether you want to play it, or if you're already playing, how to play best as Gondor. I really hope you enjoy. So first up is the starting commander given to players who choose Gondor. This commander is Faramir. He's a commander that seeks to either empower men-based units, but also to give a lot of damage buffs in the first couple of rounds to inflict very high early round burst damage. He gives some very useful buffs such as Pursuit and Initiative as well. His personal stats are okay, but there are better commanders if you do decide to swap him out when you choose Gondor, though his Respect 10 item is very good, granting all units initiative and a good damage and defense boost. So if you are looking to use him, it's worth taking him to Respect 10. For units, Gondor starts with the Númenórean quarters, which allows the use of high defense men units. These units are strong for early game, as the high defense helps to mitigate your early troop losses. The only issue is the lack of a really powerful damage unit, with no ranged units being present in the Gondor troop tree. Instead, you get use of the spearmen, you get mounted resistance units, and you also get the Dunedain tree, which deals high damage to range units. But there's nothing such as a sentinel you get in the elven tree, or the axe thrower in the dwarven tree, that can really deal high damage. This isn't really rectified in the second unlock, to be honest, which is the dwarven quarters, as the early unlock of those troops also allows you to get the dwarves. However, the dwarves do give you some good early siege units, which can allow you then to deal good siege and start making progression towards keeps early on. The third quarters unlocked is the Elven quarters, which gives you access to sentinels and bow knights, so this is where you'll really start to deal some higher DPS. The final quarters unlocked is the Rohirrim quarters, which isn't great as of course you get the cataphracts in the Gondor skill tree, however you don't get the access to the rest of the mounted units until later on, so using a commander such as Theoden may not become viable until your third or fourth quarter unlock. The unique unit of Gondor is the Swan Knight. The stats alone look pretty decent, however it is in their unique abilities that their true power lies. The Swan Knights at the maximum upgrade level up their defense by an enormous 100 for the first 3 rounds of any given fight, taking their defense to almost 200 before any gear is even taken into account. Additionally, they take all the damage other units would normally take, and this is on top of being a mounted unit, so they can reduce their damage even further by fully upgrading them. This high defense and HP, even more than that of the cataphract, can be an absolute nightmare for the enemy army, as they have to then force their way through this roadblock army before they can get to your high DPS units. So pairing them with a lot of DPS units that can just absolutely annihilate the enemy army before they can be taken down can be devastating. So as T4 units go, they are very strong. However, the one issue with them is that they are extremely expensive. If you look at their costs, they are almost twice as expensive as the cataphract, which on its own is already an extremely expensive unit. So you have to make sure that you balance where you use these units and how many you used compared to much cheaper units such as the Guard of the Tower or the Cataphract itself. The unique ring skill of Gondor is Organisational Efficiency. This increases your stone and lumber gathering production by 10%. So this doesn't actually increase your resource production, only the amount of resources you get through using the gathering ring skill. This could be useful, as by the time you unlock it you might be gathering to get some of the higher spec buildings. However, it doesn't have any kind of factor into PvP, which is where the ring skills really need to show their own, as of course this game is a PvP game. If you get attacked by another faction, additional gathering isn't going to help you in comparison to say Lothlorien's ring skill, which reduces their wounded recovery time by 10%, so they can just pump more troops onto the battlefield a lot quicker than you can. Meanwhile, you've only got boosted gathering. So I'd say this ring skill is pretty poor when compared to the ring skills of a few of the other factions. Next, we're going to look at the location of Gondor. Located in the very south of the map, Gondor has its south edge protected by the edge of the map, and has plenty of neutral ground between them and the nearest enemies. The closest faction is Rohan to the north, who usually seek to avoid early war so will not be a threat, particularly as there's a lot of crossings and borders for them to cross to get to you first. The next primary threat is Mordor to the east, and this faction will normally move towards Gondor to try and secure South Ithilien and Horondor, particularly in early seasons where they want to access the Mumakal neutral units. In later seasons, you also pick up the Variags faction, which additionally will try and push through in a similar vein to Gondor, although normally from a little bit more north through the Dead Marshes. To the west, there's plenty of empty real estate for Gondor to claim. Usually they will pick up Andrast, Nanlefnui, Langstrad, Paths of the Dead, Leindon, Belfalas, Dor Emil, Lebanon, and Anorion. So a ton of regions can just be occupied by Gondor, which just provides an enormous amount of resources. The heart of Gondor's land is also very well defended. Ered Nimraz, the mountain range, to the north of the Bay of Belfalas, and the network of ferries that unite Lebanon and Horondor are the main access points to the heart of Gondor's lands, and these areas are very simple to defend as they contain a lot of choke points and crossings. The capital, however, Minas Tirith, which lies on the eastern side of Gondor's lands, is in a terrible position to defend. It has very few tactical positions with which you can set up and defend, and the main of these is Osgiliath, though this borders Ithilien, which usually gets populated by evil factions very early on. If Osgiliath is taken, it becomes impossible to hold Minas Tirith. Another thing to consider is the access to Dol Guldur, the endgame of any faction. While it's not that far from Gondor, by the endgame you will have to fight your way through Mordor or Variags, as well as Rohan and potentially Lothlorien as well, to get there. So location-wise for Dol Guldur, being on this south side of the map is a pretty big disadvantage, unless of course you are allied or united with one of these factions. Now, looking into resources in this land. The resources available to Gondor are plentiful and very well balanced. There's no excess of any single resource, so you get a nice balance of every resource and you can make sure that you have good production in the ways that you need it. So, high stone in the early game, and then you can push this towards grain in the late game. There is also so much neutral land for Gondor to expand into, as I said earlier. So you shouldn't face the issue where your players are competing for tiles. Instead, they can just move into one of these neutral areas and pick up an enormous additional amount of resources. In addition to this, there is huge clusters of very dense and powerful resource tiles available to Gondor. One of these is on the northern coast of Osgiliath, and this gives you an enormous number of grain tiles of varying powers between 130 all the way up to 300. The other cluster of resources is on what's referred to as the Horondor Treasure Island. This includes an enormous amount of stone, lumber, grain and ore, so all the resources you could need, but in particular there is a huge amount of grain, as you can see here. This large amount of resource should be harnessed by Gondor as soon as possible to give early game advantage, which can then snowball and make you extremely powerful mid to late game. Neutral units available to Gondor are also a very big positive of this faction. In particular, the Oathbreaker Undead units available in the Paths of the Dead and Langstrad are very strong. Whilst the overall stats do not look impressive, they can reduce physical damage by a massive 90%. They have great utility as physical damage tanks for damage commanders such as Dwalin or Aragorn, and are even better when combined with a Respect 5 or higher King of the Dead commander. Whilst these units are very weak to damage other than physical damage, you often run into physical damage commanders if you're facing the good side. After Season 3, they also gained the Seafarer Tier 3 men unit, which can make defending the areas surrounding Gondor a little easier. They mitigate commander damage and counter popular commanders such as Gimli and Aragorn, and on top of that they also deal up to 50% more damage when battling on crossings, which can make them a very powerful defensive unit. For commander levelling, Gondor sits firmly in the mid-tier area. The abundant resources and also the large numbers of crossings and tunnels can assist with early and mid-game levelling. Though the lack of a strong neutral unit camp such as Ents or Eagles can make getting to the max level difficult, meaning that for large chunks of XP to get to the higher levels, you're basically left to rely on the Mind Sharpener function, unless you can push into another area such as Fangorn Forest for the Ent tiles. So, in summary, Gondor sits in a very balanced place in almost all areas. Without any huge overwhelming strengths or any glaring weaknesses, Gondor can be a strong faction for both beginner players and also experienced players. A well-organised faction that knows how to harness the large resources of Gondor and also manoeuvre the map successfully can have a hugely successful season whilst playing as Gondor. Anyway, with that, that's everything I have to offer. If you've enjoyed, please consider dropping a like and also consider the subscribe button, as I do release regular Rise to War content. If you do, I really hope to see you on the next one.